It happened in 2018, a time when tradition was held above all else. In one of the oldest fraternities on campus, hazing wasn't just an initiation. It was an institution passed down through generations of legacy families, a ritual that was as old as the fraternity itself. But that fall, during Pledge Week, something went horribly wrong. The fraternity was one of the most prestigious on campus, a group of young men whose families had long histories of influence and wealth. Their entitlement was palpable. In whispered conversations, professors even talked about their names, a constant reminder of old money and old power. The pledges were told that enduring the trials was simply part of a process that had been repeated for decades. They were to sacrifice their pride and sometimes even their health for acceptance. And so, on that fateful night, they lined up for what was to be known as Hell Night. Imagine an old house, miles away from the bustling campus. A decrepit building owned by the fraternity that had long lost its charm. The house stood isolated in the fading light of autumn, its windows dark and empty, its walls soaked in secrets. There were no neighbors to see what happened, no passerby to intervene. The building itself seemed to echo with the memories of past rituals. The pledges were forced down into the basement, blindfolded and with their hands bound. In the cold, damp air of that underground room, every sound seemed amplified. The drip of a leaking pipe, the faint murmur of anxious breaths, and the heavy footsteps of those who had come before. A few flickering candles provided the only light, casting erratic, dancing shadows on moldy walls and peeling paint. This was not a place of honor, but one of humiliation and dread. The hazing began slowly at first with the passing of a bottle of vodka. Each pledge was forced to drink, even if his stomach churned in protest. If he gagged, he had to drink again. If he vomited, the cycle did not stop. Amid the shouts and crude laughter, there was no room for compassion. No room for compassion. It was all explained away as tradition, a test of endurance that had to be met regardless of the personal cost. Then came the paddles. The wooden implements, worn smooth by years of use, were described as symbolic. But as the night grew darker and the air thicker with the scent of alcohol and fear, it became clear that there was nothing symbolic about the violence being unleashed. These were full-grown men swinging paddles with a fervor that bordered on brutality. Every blow was a step deeper into chaos. In the midst of the turmoil, one pledge began to falter. His body, already weakened by relentless drinking, could not withstand the barrage. At one point, he murmured quietly, almost inaudibly, "I don't feel good." His voice was lost amidst the jeers and crude jokes of his peers. They told him to man up and forced him to continue drinking. One of them grabbed the bottle and poured more alcohol down his throat as if that would somehow erase his growing weakness. Another swung the paddle with a force that belied the casual tone of the evening. And then, an instant that seemed to stretch forever, he collapsed. His face hit the cold, hard concrete, his body crumpling as if it were nothing more than a broken puppet. At first there was silence, a pause where everyone assumed it was just part of the act, a performance meant to test their resolve. But when someone finally leaned over to check on him, they saw that his lips were blue, his skin clammy, and his eyes unresponsive. Panic began to replace the earlier bravado. In that suffocating basement, fear took root. Yet, instead of rushing to help, the group fell into chaos, arguing over what should be done next. Some whispered that they should dump him at the nearest hospital, while others insisted on a cleaning up so first to avoid the wrath of the fraternity's reputation. It was a debate that seemed to last an eternity in those final moments, hours filled with frantic whispers and misguided justifications. A single voice, the only one that might have still carried a hint of reason, suggested calling 911 immediately. His words were drowned out by the collective anxiety of those around him. They were more concerned with protecting their future, their membership, their legacy, than with saving a life. In that grim, echoing basement, human compassion was sacrificed on the altar of tradition. By the time someone finally managed to dial for help, the damage was irreparable. The autopsy would later reveal that the tragedy was caused by a lethal combination of alcohol poisoning and blunt force trauma. Yet, when questioned, the fraternity members maintained that they had no idea how things had spiraled so out of control. The official story was simple, almost laughably so. The pledger drank too much and fell. In the aftermath, the fraternity closed ranks. Parents of the victim, desperate for answers, were met with vague statements and polite evasions. The college conducted a quiet investigation that resulted in only a minor suspension, a mere slap on the wrist for a group of young men who had transgressed in such a grievous manner. They were allowed to continue their lives, to graduate, and to step into the world with the stain of that night concealed behind the veil of just a tragic accident. But one thing could not be erased: the need for a scapegoat. In the meticulous and cold calculation that followed, the fraternity singled out one of the pledges, the one who didn't come from money, the one who could not afford a good lawyer. They cast him as the culprit, claiming that he had taken it too far and that he was out of control. The legal system, swayed by the power of legacy and the absence of reliable evidence, did not see through the convenient narrative. He was given 6 years behind bars, a fate that was less about justice for the victim and more about protecting the privileged few. As the years went by, the memory of that night faded into whispered regrets and unspoken guilt. The fraternity members went on to carve out successful lives, their reputations untarnished in the public eye, while the shadow of that horrific night remained hidden in dark corners of memory. Some of them even recall the incident with a bitter humor, as if mocking the notion that they could ever be truly responsible. College, they say, should be the best years of your life, a time of discovery, of friendships, and of growth. But for one young man, that night marked the end of everything. His final year, once filled with potential and promise, was transformed into a nightmare from which there was no waking. And for those who orchestrated the night, the remorse was buried beneath layers of arrogance and entitlement. Even now, in the quiet moments before dawn or in the reflective solitude of a busy day, one can almost hear the echoes of that night. The sound of a paddle striking against the silence, the desperate gasp for breath, and the cold, hard realization that some traditions are so deeply flawed they should never be repeated. The story lives on, not as a legend of youthful bravado, but as a stark reminder of the consequences when loyalty to tradition trumps the value of a human life. And while the man who was blamed spent years behind bars, the rest of the fraternity moved forward with their lives, their laughter, and camaraderie forever stained by fateful evening. They continue to gather, to reminisce, and in their rare moments of candid reflection, one might catch a glimpse of regret in their eyes. Regret for the friend they lost, for the innocence they sacrificed, and for the cost of a tradition that demanded far too high a price. If there is any justice in this world, if any redemption for those who have been wronged, it lies not in the silence of those who have the power to forget, but in the voices that refuse to be silenced. One day, perhaps, the truth will out. One day, the legacy of that night will be laid bare for all to see, and the responsibility of those who laughed in the face of tragedy will be fully realized. Until that day comes, the story remains, a haunting, unyielding reminder that sometimes tradition is not worth the price we pay.